Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Pursuit of Certainty by Shirley Robin Letwin. This book is from 1965, although the copy I have is from 1998, and it is about four individuals: David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Beatrice Webb. The last section about Beatrice Webb is shorter than the others, maybe significantly shorter, I think. I'm only going to talk about one of these figures, and that's David Hume. We've already looked at David Hume back in episode 98. He talked about cause and effect, causation, the continuity of the world, and the inability to draw conclusions about cause and effect from a rational analysis. Ultimately, it wasn't something that could be reduced to reason when we ask ourselves, what is our expectation that things will work in the future the way that they worked in the past? Any sort of prediction we make about how anything works, to understand anything, we have to be able to assume that things are going to unfold continually in the same manner over time. Our experiments will have the same results over time. What do we base our assumption that things are going to continue on in the future the way they have done thus far derived from? What is that derived from? Just ultimately, it boils down to experience and habit. Habit drawn from experience. Not rationality and not reason, but habit drawn from experience. And I think David Hume, as I said in that episode, I think David Hume is misunderstood. I think when people call him a skeptic, they may misrepresent him to some extent. He is a skeptic, but he's also more than a skeptic. As I said in that episode, well, as the author of the essay that I read last episode said, he loses the rational underpinnings of reality, but replaces them with something else. And so it's not a total tearing down of our ability to know things. It's just a replacement of the underpinning. And maybe it's not really the same sort of knowledge. At any rate, I want to return to David Hume because I want to talk a little bit about some of his politics and some of his thoughts about virtues. But first, I want to just revisit briefly some of his ideas about causation and custom from another author, from another perspective than we saw last time. And so I'm going to read, like in all of my episodes, a couple sections here. I have 5 actually sections that I'm going to be reading. The first one talking about custom and causation, like I just said, the connection between custom and causation. And so she says the following, quote, Hume had no wish to deny that there was a real connection between cause and effect, or that all our reasoning depended on our being convinced that the connection was a necessary one. Quite the contrary, the very necessity of the causal relation was crucial for his purpose. The cause and effect were connected by contiguity and succession. Hume granted at once. But that did not explain, he pointed out, what was really distinctive about the causal relation, that it seemed to be a necessary connection. Shall we then rest contented with these two relations of contiguity and succession as affording a complete idea of causation? By no means. An object may be contiguous and prior to another without being considered its cause. There is also a necessary connection to be taken into consideration. We can see that the dog moves and that the stone does not. We see the facts and can conceive of their contrary, yet we say that the dog must move and the stone can not. In the same way, we do not simply say that every change has a cause, but that it must have a cause. What gives us assurance of that necessity? If the traditional answer that the necessity is seen by reason, by an intuitive insight into the nature or the cause or of the effect were correct, Hume argued, we should be able to see causal necessity from one instance. We could then say that it was impossible for the one object not to follow, or be conceived not to follow, but in fact, we can conceive of causes and their effects as unconnected. And what is even more important, we never conclude that there is a causal connection until we have seen the same events related in the same way a number of times. And there is nothing in several instances repeated that there is not in any one of them. It cannot be that anything within the objects gives rise to the idea of necessity. The cause must then lie in the mind, not in the objects. Though the several resembling instances which give rise to the idea of power have no influence on each other, and can never produce any new quality in the object, yet the observation of this resemblance produces a new impression in the mind, which is its real model. Necessity, then, is the effect of this observation, and is nothing but an internal impression of the mind, or a determination to carry our thoughts from one object to another. The necessity assumed is not, and cannot be, a necessity of reason, i.e. intuitively or demonstratively understood. It is only a necessity of feeling, in short, a belief, and it arises from custom. Hume thus reduced what had formerly been described as an intuition about the essence of things to nothing more exalted than an experience of a customary conjunction between two objects. Again, he was involved in the difficulty that afflicted his analysis of abstract ideas. He did not explain what enabled the mind to recognize like causes or customary conjunctions. If, in fact, we can know only what we have already experienced, how can we depart from experience to recognize an object's similarity to the ones we have experienced in the past? But Hume's attention was concentrated on what he was denying, that the causal inference was an operation of reason, enabling man to discover the rational pattern imprinted on nature by the divine mind. Having shown that merely custom explained the feeling of necessary connection between cause and effect, Hume left those who delight in the discovery and contemplation of final causes to employ their wonder and admiration elsewhere. He had also eliminated the supposed difference between moral and physical necessity, for he had shown that all necessity lay in the mind, and arose from the influence of the repeated constant conjunction of two objects. Instead of necessity, there was only chance, reduced to order by custom. End quote. So that's a pretty good section that lays out like the nuts and bolts of his thoughts about custom and causation, and how we can't get the truth of causation from reason, but only from custom, and the sort of effect that has on how we think about it. It is a sort of almost a degradation in a way to think that we have some sort of special capacity to perceive rational underpinnings versus habits of behavior that we've just picked up by circumstance, by sheer repetition, and we associate things together. But I think it's probably correct, and I think also that it's considered a degradation only by custom. I don't think it's completely correct, because we don't just pick up whatever, like we're not totally plastic people and we'll pick up whatever way of life, whatever way of being strictly by custom. We will also follow along certain like biological predeterminations of behavior. We have certain human ways about us, and our behavior is somewhat predictable, even across different societies that will have different sets of custom. There's similarities and differences. Some of the similarities can be tied to human nature and begin to look more like biological frameworks. So, moving to the next section, he talks about virtue. And again, this could be considered from one perspective as a degradation of virtue from a sort of higher plane of virtue, a higher sense of understanding of moral truths, to a more base biological experiential, like mundane cause of virtue. She says, quote, "Morality is certain, and there is a clear distinction between virtue and vice," Hume affirmed. He denied only that it was absolute. He managed to preserve the certainty of morals without letting it become absolute by founding it on sentiment. Virtue and vice were not matters of fact whose existence could be discovered by reason. In willful murder, for instance, no one can observe anything that could be called vice. The only fact in the case that makes us call it vicious is a feeling in some person. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. Vice and virtue are not then qualities in objects, not anything outside human beings, but perceptions within them. When you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the particular constitution of your nature, you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. Vice and virtue, therefore, may be compared to sounds, colors, heat and cold, which, according to modern philosophy, are not qualities in objects, but perceptions in the mind. That his moral theory was a great advance in speculative science, Hume readily claimed, but he denied that it had any radical consequences for practice. Prudence alone perhaps required him to say so, at a time when the arbiters of morality cried down any modification of their theories as a challenge to all established notions of good and bad. And in one sense it was perfectly true that Hume's theory left practice unaffected. It did not sanction murder or incest or deny the value of honesty and gratitude. It did, however, radically change the manner in which these standards were to be applied. This was inevitable once Hume traced virtue to a basic principle that made it impossible to think of morality in the old way as a divine command. Instead, Hume showed that virtuous behavior is simply useful to mankind, that it conforms to, rather than violates, what is natural to men. The utility of an action or character, he explained, arouses a natural sentiment of approval. Because of the sympathy between men, this approval becomes general, that is, attached to other things and men and to whatever contributes to the happiness of society. All men can feel a sympathy with the possessor of a useful quality. So men come to approve what benefits not only themselves but also others, and what is useful to men is generally called a virtue. Virtue does not then require men either to discern superhuman purposes or to deny their human needs and wants. Quite the contrary, it shows how best to satisfy them. To be virtuous, men need not struggle with or repress their natural inclinations. All morality depends on the natural course of our passions and actions. The virtuous man is drawn to his duty without an effort or endeavor. Virtue, therefore, is congenial to men, and only superstition is odious and burdensome. Moral conflict is not a combat between divine reason and brute passion, but a purely human balancing of the calm against the violent passions. Thus Hume removed the dismal dress with which divines and philosophers had disguised virtue, and demonstrated that a happy life, spent in festivals, mirth, philosophizing, and singing, was, as the ancient Strabo had taught, the best way for man to imitate divine perfection. End quote. So there we see his perspective about virtue, that it's really basically biological. He says it's like color, sounds, colors, heat and cold, not qualities and objects, but perceptions in the mind. If you see something vicious happen, its viciousness exists in your mind and in your experience of your perception, your experience of your observation. It's a feeling that you have when you see something that you consider vicious or virtuous. It's not something that is inherent in the objects. It's a human mode of perception, a human mode of experience. And he said, basically, because of the time he lived in, that it wasn't really any change in the way men would behave. But I'm sure that it really is. The more you change what we understand virtue to be, it's not going to change completely. It's not a complete rewrite. She says, well, he still disapproves of murder and other things. He doesn't say, and she says Hume still approves of gratitude and other good things. He approves of vice and disapproves of virtue. It's not a total inversion. He's just saying that virtues are things that help society. Virtues are behaviors that are beneficial to other people, beneficial to society, because things that are beneficial to society are beneficial to you as a member of society. And virtues meld well with a functioning society, and vices don't. And that's a very materialistic perspective about virtue and vice. But again, I think that's probably not 100% accurate, because again, there's a biological component that Hume doesn't really take into effect. He talks about it all as if it's all customs, habits, and things of that nature, and not ingrained biological tendencies, which we now more understand through evolutionary psychology, the role that evolution has played in giving us moral instincts above and beyond just cultural habits, but hardwired instincts gained through evolution. He's writing well before Darwin, and so the evolutionary aspect of it doesn't come into his analysis. But anyway, he's on to something, though. Considering that he was writing so long ago, I think he's really on to something. And so, continuing on to discuss his concepts of virtue, and begins to talk, like in the end of the last quote, a bit about how it resembles pagan understanding of virtues. She says, quote, Hume insisted that pride is not a vice, but a virtue. All heroic virtue, he pointed out, all that we admire as greatness of mind, courage, intrepidity, ambition, love of glory, magnanimity, is either nothing but a steady and well-established pride and self-esteem, or partakes largely of that passion. The pagans never decried pride, and those who are anxious to improve life in this world invariably esteem it. They believe that a genuine and hearty pride or self-esteem, if well concealed and well founded, is essential to the character of a man of honor, and that there is no quality of the mind which is more indispensably requisite to procure the esteem and approbation of mankind. Only the religious declaimers make pride a vice. They denounce it as purely pagan, natural, and represent to us the excellency of the Christian religion, which places humility in the rank of virtues, and corrects the judgment of the world, and even of philosophers, who so generally admire all the efforts of pride and ambition. But humility, beyond what good breeding and decency require of us, is merely one of that whole train of monkish virtues, which men of sense reject, because they neither advance a man's fortune in the world, nor render him a valuable member of society, neither qualify him for the entertainment of company, nor increase his power of self-enjoyment. Nevertheless, in some other ways, Hume insisted on an obligation to depart from nature and submit to reason. For he found in reason the source of general rules, without which social relations were impossible. Even good breeding depended, he pointed out, on neglecting natural sentiments in favor of certain established forms. The rule that we must never praise ourselves, but should rather underrate our true qualities, for instance, had become established because men tend to be conceited, and cannot judge when they have given too free expression to their exaggerated self-esteem. As such conceit annoys others and destroys easy relations, it seems best to observe a general rule forbidding any self-praise, for thus we are assured that neither our own conceit nor that of others will disrupt conversation and conviviality. The rules of justice, are of the same character. Without them, each case would be decided on its own merits, as each man judged them. We would grant a friend the property he claimed from our enemy. The tall boy who had only a short coat would appropriate the long coat from the short boy. We would conduct ourselves entirely by particular judgments that considered only the characters and circumstances of the moment. However much this might accord with our natural sentiments, Hume reminds us, "'Tis easy to observe that the world would produce an infinite convulsion in human society, and that the avidity and partiality of men would quickly bring disorder into the world. In order to bring peace and stability into social life, men set up general and inflexible rules, which ensure that they will always view certain issues from the same standpoint, regardless of the particular situation. They agree to judge some matters not as the different circumstances surrounding each dictate, but from a common standpoint accepted by all. The rules of justice are, as a result, both natural and artificial. They are natural because the need for them is inseparable from the nature of the human species. They do not arise from humor and caprice, could not one day be dispensed with as if they were a mere matter of fashion. The interest on which justice is founded is the greatest imaginable, and extends to all times and places, and it cannot possibly be served by any other invention. It is obvious and discovers itself on the very formation of society. All these causes render the rule of justice steadfast and immutable, at least as immutable as human nature. They might even, Hume said, be called laws of nature. Yet at the same time, the rules of justice are artificial, for they engage men to act contrary to their natural sentiments. They extend what is felt in one set of circumstances to cover many others. They are contrary to the common principles of human nature, which accommodate themselves to the circumstances and have no stated invariable method of operation. The distinction between natural judgments and artificial rules was all important to Hume. It not only explains the origin of justice, but is at the heart of his moral attitude, and defines his disagreement with conventional views of morality. It determines as well his attitude to politics. It arises from his sensitivity to the contrast between impersonal and personal judgments, between abstract, general, unyielding rules, and particular judgments conforming to the conditions and needs of the moment. What is generally regarded as Hume's defense of nature may be better described as a defense of the personal against the impersonal, the concrete against the abstract. Hume stressed the deficiencies of impersonal judgments as no other philosopher had. Virtue and vice, indeed all natural qualities, he reminds us, run insensibly into each other. They approach one another by such insensible degrees that it is exceedingly difficult, if not absolutely impossible, to determine when the one ends and the other begins. But general rules make exact definitions and admit of no degree. They treat cases similar, in some respects, as if they were similar in all, without considering what tangle of circumstances and motives may excuse one but not another. Even when rules admit of exceptions, it is only according to a rule. The false distinctions imposed by a general rule give it an air of clarity, but in reality it is much more obscure than a particular judgment. It covers many particulars, and as any one of them may be thought to represent it, a general rule usually means different things to different people. Besides, a general rule never allows us to dispense with judgment and experience. No matter how perfect in itself, it still needs to be applied properly. One must recognize, first of all, which general rule is relevant. Then one must know how to take account of the special circumstances in which the rule is being applied. Neither reasoning nor knowledge is enough. Prudence is essential. End quote. Okay, so she's talking about Hume's positions on virtues, and he gets into justice. He gets into talking about justice here. And first he talks about pride. She talks about pride, his position about pride. And, he's much more pro-pride, and he likes the way the pagans were pro-pride. And I agree, I'm right there with him. And But when he gets to justice, he points out how justice is both natural and artificial. In some ways, rules of justice cause us to act against our natural behaviors, but they're also natural in that we cannot live in a society that doesn't have any concept of justice at all. Different sets of rules will come together to form different belief systems and different understandings of justice in different societies, but every society has some comprehension of some form of justice. And he says it's like a law of nature. She says they might even, Hume said, be called laws of nature. And at the same time, it's artificial in the way that they demand us that we suppress parts of our nature in order to conform to justice. We may be tempted to do unjust things, but we suppress them. And so there's a component of artificiality to it. And especially when you get into the premise of societies that impose rules on the members of societies. And the rule is a general rule, and each circumstance is unique. And so there's a discrepancy between the situation in itself and the application of the rule. And he says that you can never really get away with escape from the particular judgments anyway, because you have to take the rule and apply it to the particular circumstance. And always and everywhere, prudence is essential. And that's a big part of David Hume's whole way of viewing things. Prudence is one of the most important virtues, I think, to David Hume. And continuing on along those lines, I want to move into his positions about politics. And to start with, I want to talk about Hume's approach to liberty and authority, and the balance between them. So in this section, she says, quote, "It made no sense to look for a clear rule by giving precedence either to liberty or to authority. Both inevitably have a part in every government. It is only a question of degree, of the proper proportions between them, and that question has to be answered anew each time it arises. Whatever may be said, the people always retain a right of resistance, since it is impossible, even in the most despotic governments, to deprive them of it. In a mixed government it must be so, since the whole point of a mixed government is to allow the parts of the Constitution to resist one another. If the people are supposed to share in the power of the government, they must be able to defend their share. Those, therefore, who would seem to respect our free government, and yet deny the right of resistance, have renounced all pretensions to common sense, and do not merit a serious answer. In any case, opposing all attempts to alter a government is simply foolish, because human institutions must constantly be mended. New laws must be passed to fit new circumstances. Every law innovates somewhat, and it is not always easy to discover how much a law innovates, whether it merely reforms or makes a radical change. Sheer necessity makes it impossible to keep the balance between authority and liberty unchanged. Under every government there must then be a perpetual intestine struggle, open or secret, between authority and liberty, in which neither can absolutely win. No exalted matter of principle is involved in disagreements over the propriety of resisting the established government. Everyone agrees that where obedience brings on public ruin, it is right to oppose the government with force. On the other hand, no one defends the use of violence in any but extreme circumstances. The disagreement, then, is only on the degree of necessity which can justify resistance and render it lawful and commendable. And there is no escaping such disagreement, because men have different temperaments. Men of mild tempers, who love peace and order and detest sedition and civil wars, are more inclined to favor the established government, while men of bold and generous spirits, who are passionate lovers of liberty and think no evil comparable to subjection and slavery, more willingly risk revolutions. The only way out is to find the proper medium between extremes, and that is difficult to do, because the very words used in the discussion are bound to be ambiguous and confusing, and because good and ill run so gradually into one another as even to render our sentiments doubtful and uncertain." End quote. So there we start to get some of his thoughts about politics, and he's talking about liberty and authority. He says there's no way to, again, this should start to sound familiar, there's no way to make a clear general rule that gives precedence to liberty or authority. This is where the libertarians fail. They take liberty as the core principle and measure every other aspect according to it. That goes against Hume's whole concept, and I think it goes against mine as well. You can't make a rule based solely on the one or the other, liberty or authority. They both have a part in every government to various degrees. Every government is different, every people is different, every circumstance is different, the era is different. There's constant adjustment to the balance between liberty and authority in a struggle that neither can ever win. This should sound familiar not only in David Hume's writings, but Aristotle as well. And I think it's come up several times in several writers, and I think it's been a kind of a theme that I've been hitting on, that it's also somewhat polytheistic. If you think about the ancient Romans and Greeks, liberty, at least, and even in a way, authority, could be considered deities, struggling deities, and that our society and our world is comprised of struggling forces, just like Heraclitus would say. These struggling forces are things like liberty, order, love, war, creativity, individuality, conformity, all of different forces that push and pull us in different directions. And prudence is how we determine how far we go in any direction. But like Aristotle talked about with the golden mean, you don't want to go too far in any direction. You become unbalanced. So moving to the next section, she talks about how Hume considered the best approach to politics to be a moderate, prudent conservatism. And she says, quote, "Radical or violent action rarely brings the improvement it promises. Although tyrannicide was much approved of in ancient times because it freed mankind from many of these monsters and seemed to keep the others in awe, whom the sword or poniard could not reach, experience has taught modern men that such means do not usually achieve their ends. On the same grounds, Hume opposed war against France, whatever her ambitions. The best protection against the danger that the French might establish a universal monarchy was to maintain steady resistance through a balance of power, and to hope that the natural revolutions of human affairs, together with unforeseen events and accidents, may guard us against universal monarchy and preserve the world from so great an evil." Nothing like a belief in providence lay behind Hume's conservatism. He was only certain that crusades brought destruction and evil, and the less drastic but firm resistance was often aided in unforeseen ways by the natural revolution of human affairs, that in general human life is more governed by fortune than by reason. Even the excellence of the British Constitution, he often pointed out, was mainly the work of fortune. History teaches us what a great mixture of accident commonly concurs with a small ingredient of wisdom and foresight in erecting the complicated fabric of the most perfect government. It was not out of faith in a beneficent natural order, but because he was skeptical of any human attempt to see and control all, that Hume trusted to chance more than radical remedies. His affinity was not with Burke, but with Montaigne, who said, "It seems that our opinions and deliberations depend quite as much upon fortune, and that it involves our judgment also in its confusion and uncertainty." Since men could so much more readily do damage than good, it was best in politics to aim too low rather than too high. It was safest to assume that every man was thoroughly selfish, although in fact many men were not. Political writers have established it as a maxim that in contriving any system of government in fixing the several checks and controls of the Constitution, every man ought to be supposed a knave, and to have no other end in all his actions than private interests. Without this, say they, we shall find, in the end, that we have no security for our liberties or possessions, except the goodwill of our rulers. That is, we shall have no security at all. Insofar as the magistrate set out to make men better than they are, he must not try to substitute a virtue for every vice. He must not hope to free men from every defect. This concerns not the magistrate who aims only at possibilities. Very often a vice could be cured effectively and safely only by being replaced with another vice. And in that case, the magistrate had to decide only which was the least pernicious to society. Hume accordingly argued that luxury, even when it may become excessive and give rise to many ills, should be tolerated, because it was preferable to the idleness that would commonly replace it. The man of the proper political disposition would confine government to profane tasks. He would expect it to mediate collisions of interest, to enforce and sometimes impose agreements between parties, either to keep out of each other's way or to engage in some common endeavor, and generally to protect members of society when they engage in their private activities. Where it had to interfere was fairly obvious. The government need not intervene between two neighbors who wish to drain a meadow which they possess in common, because each will know the other's mind, and both must perceive that if either fails in his part, the whole project will collapse. But it is different when large numbers are involved. 1,000 persons could not agree to any such action, it being difficult for them to concert so complicated a design, and still more difficult for them to execute it, while each seeks a pretext to free himself of the trouble and expense, and would lay the whole burden on others. Political society easily remedies both these inconveniences. In addition, the government might be expected to look after morals, in the most rudimentary sense, by encouraging men to be honest and industrious. The magistrate must subdue antisocial inclinations and stimulate industry, and he must check extravagance, corruption, or inefficiency in government, but these are all mundane duties. End quote. So in that section, it sounds like Hume is really all about just getting practical things done, accomplishing the things that are practical for government to do. If it's practical for people to do a thing like draining a meadow, if it's practical and feasible and is going to work well for two people to just collaborate with each other and drain their meadow, then so be it. Let them do it themselves. The government need not involve itself. But if it is more practical, more feasible, more effective for the government to do it, then let the government do it. That seems to be his approach. He doesn't want to apply a rule about liberty and authority to every circumstance according to some abstract rule. If it works one way, do it that way. If it works a different way, then do it that way. And in two circumstances they work differently, then in each circumstance do it the way that works. That's his practical approach to politics. This is, I think, a pretty good, solid defense of prudence as being a core conservative virtue. And prudence is complemented, I think, by wisdom. The two go hand in hand. Knowing when to lean more toward liberty and when to lean more toward authority will still depend on wisdom and intelligence. So with that, I will wrap this episode up. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.